the public after the presentation. So keep an eye out on our website for the recording if you'd like it later. The next thing I'd like to do is mute everybody in the room who has since dialed into the conference line. So give me a second here. Okay, everybody's unmuted, and let me unmute Alicia. Oh, it looks like she is. So Alicia, I think we're ready to begin.
Great, thank you, John. So the goal of this webinar is to provide you with a basic understanding of how to adequately document your compliance with Section 106, thereby allowing the State Historic Preservation Officer the ability to review and comment in a timely manner. So I'd like to start with the impetus of why you are consulting with the State Historic Preservation Officer in the first place. So consultation with the Shippo is required by the Section 106 process of the National Historic Preservation Act and its implementing regulations at 36 CFR 800. Section 106 requires federal agencies to take into account the effects of their undertakings on historic properties. And one way in which they do this is by consulting with the Shippo. Section 106 is required when there is a federal or federal license action, including grants, licenses, and permits. And it is also required when a federal agency has determined that their action is an undertaking that has the potential to affect historic properties. One thing I want to point out is that the lead agency must complete the Section 106 process prior to the expenditure of any federal funds or issuance of license or permit. So this is kind of an outline, bulleted outline of what the Section 106 process entails. So once the federal agency has determined that their action is an undertaking that has the potential to affect historic properties, the Section 106 process begins. And one of the first steps in this process is the agency is to identify consulting parties and initiate consultation. So I just wanted to make this point here that consultation starts early in the process and is also part of the process throughout each of the other steps in the Section 106. So what is consultation? So although the federal agency drives the bus throughout the Section 106 process, other parties can also be a passenger on the bus, so to speak, and this is possible through the consultation process. So basically, consultation is about dialogue that's not open-ended. It's a way for the agency to be informed of possible effects to historic properties and the resolution of effects. So let's talk about who consults throughout the Section 106 process. So the federal agency, of course, because they have the legal and financial responsibility to comply with Section 106. An agency can authorize the applicant to consult with the Shippo, but they still remain legally responsible for all determinations of eligibility and findings of effect. In some cases, the lead agency can formally delegate the Section 106 authority to another party, such as a state, local, or tribal government through legislation. So for instance, the Federal Highway Administration has delegated legal authority to Caltrans to comply with Section 106. But it's also important to note that consultants that have been hired by the lead federal agency cannot formally consult with the Shippo. If you are phoning in to a reviewer at the office, you always want to make sure that the federal agency is kept apprised. The Advisory Council on Historic Preservation also participates in the Section 106 process. They oversee Section 106 review and issues the regulations that implement it. They're also invited to participate, especially when there is a adverse effect to historic properties and the resolution of an adverse effect, but they can decline to participate. Other required parties, of course, is the Shippo and tribal historic preservation officers, which have the same responsibility as the Shippo, but on tribal lands. And then Indian tribes The regulations define Indian tribes as those that are federally recognized. And of course, local governments that may have jurisdiction over the area that the undertaking is occurring, and applicants. Additional parties could be the public, historical societies, and other interested parties. Non-federally recognized tribes are within the category of other interested parties. So when should consultation begin? Ideally early and often throughout the Section 106 process. At the very latest, the identification phase, basically because this is when other parties can help the agency to identify historic properties and also initiate discussion of avoidance measures and/or resolution of adverse effects. So let's talk about the role of the State Historic Preservation Officer, or the Shippo. California State Historic Preservation Officer is Julianne Polanco. The Shippo is a mandatory consulting party. The Shippo reflects the interests of the state and its citizens in the preservation of their cultural heritage. The Shippo advises and assists federal agencies in carrying out their Section 106 responsibilities, and they also provide peer review of federal agency documentation. Most importantly, they cooperate with agencies, local governments, and organizations to ensure that historic properties are taken into consideration at all levels of planning and development. On our website, you can find two versions of a Section 106 consultation submittal checklist. I definitely advise that you check these out. There's a short checklist and also a more detailed annotated version. And this presentation is based on the detailed annotated version. So let's talk about formal Shippo consultation. This is initiated when an agency submits a consultation package to the Shippo, and it contains a letter that will summarize what the supporting documentation will entail. And the supporting documentation can include one or all of the following that I've listed here: scope of identification efforts, efforts to identify historic properties, evaluation of cultural resources against the National Register, assessment of adverse effects, and the resolution of adverse effects. So the consultation letter, these are some key points that you want to make sure is included in your consultation letter. Of course, you want to include a subject heading, so this can be the name of the project, federal undertaking that you would like for all future correspondence to refer to. You also want to indicate whether or not you are initiating consultation with the Shippo or continuing consultation. If you are continuing consultation, you want to make sure that you include the reference number that you were given to in correspondence with our office. You also want to indicate the regulatory process. So basically, why are you consulting with the Shippo? Are you asking for Shippo's comment on the area of potential effect, or perhaps Shippo concurrence on your determination of eligibility? Or you may be consulting with the Shippo pursuant to a programmatic agreement or a memorandum of agreement. So you want to indicate this in your letter. Also want to make sure that you not only indicate the name of the undertaking, but also the location. Where is the undertaking occurring? County, city, that type of thing. You also want to indicate whether or not you're using the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act process for Section 106 purposes. And lastly, you also want to indicate contact information. So who would you like for us to address our response letter to? So let's start with description of undertaking. Want to provide a narrative description of what the undertaking is. So I think it's really easy to just jot down, think of the basics: who, what, where, how, why, and when. So who is involved in this undertaking? Is it one federal agency? Are there more than one? Who is taking the lead? The applicant, this is information that you want to include. What is happening? What exactly is the undertaking? Is it road widening? Is it urban development? Again, where is it located? You might want to include the legal designation, So the quad that it's located on, or street address. Why is it occurring? How is it occurring? So is it a permit? Is it funding? And when? It's definitely beneficial for you to include project deadlines that you would like to meet. This always helps us to know kind of how we should consult in a timely manner. So basically you're describing all work that will occur as part of the undertaking that has the potential to affect historic properties. The next step is to provide a narrative description of the area of potential effect, or APE. Now, as indicated in the regulations, the APE is the geographic area or areas within which an undertaking may directly or indirectly cause alterations in the character or use of historic properties. Defining and delineating the APE is a very important step in the Section 106 process because it guides all the rest of the steps in the process, from identification to evaluation and later on resolution of effects. At this point, you're just looking at the potential for effects. The presence or absence of historic properties is irrelevant. And again, as you start your identification efforts, you might need to go back and modify the APE. So let's talk about the APE and what needs to be included. Direct effects, of course. Direct effects are all physical effects that may occur because of the undertaking. Some examples: building removal, exterior alterations, new construction, ground disturbance, of course. In some cases, an APE may include an archaeological APE and a architectural APE, but it's important to note that there's only one APE. So you have a large boundary, and within that, it encompasses the archaeological and architectural APE. Some agencies will delineate a area of direct impact, or ADI, to show exactly where ground disturbing activities are going to occur within the APE. But it's important to note that the ADI has no legal meaning under Section 106. Some other direct effects could include staging areas, access roads. So are you going to use already established roads, or are you going to have to construct roads to access the APE? And of course, equipment storage areas. Other effects include indirect effects. So these are non-physical effects that may affect historic properties. Examples are visual effects, audible effects, shadow effects, vibration, and changes in access or use. I chose this photograph because it kind of gives a good example of perhaps the construction of a railroad through a once isolated area that may perhaps have an archaeological site. So the introduction of the railroad, of course, would not only have a direct effect, but perhaps visual, audible, shadow, and vibration. So just things to keep in mind. Not all undertakings are going to have an indirect effect, but you definitely want to be aware that that is a possibility. And again, your APE, there is only one, so it's going to include both direct and indirect effects. So additional effects to consider are cumulative effects. So those are effects that may not happen in the immediate, but perhaps will happen later in time. And when feasible, you want to include the entire boundary of historic properties within the APE. This might not be feasible when you have a very large district that perhaps encompasses a great amount of acreage, or a linear historic property such as Route 66. But you want to make sure that you take into account the effects that your undertaking will have on the historic property as a whole. So that's something to keep in mind. So once you've delineated your APE, you're going to describe your APE in narrative form. So things to include, of course, locational information, physical parameters, so acreage or linear miles, all ground disturbing activities. If in your description of your undertaking you described ground disturbing activities, you want to specify exactly which components of the project are going to have a vertical APE. That's really important. Of course, dredging and borrow areas, staging and laydown areas, access routes. Again, how are you going to get to the APE? You're going to use existing roads, they're going to construct roads. It's also good to kind of provide some information on the current land use of the APE. So is it a built urban environment, or is it an area that's rural? This is information that's important to the reviewer. Also encourage you to have informal Shippo consultation with our reviewers on the APE. This isn't always necessary, of course, and we do have quite a workload, so don't always encourage it. But there may be cases in which you want to give us a call. Some cases may include unusually large or complex undertakings, access issues or concerns about delineation of whole properties, potential for visual or indirect effects, of course, controversial undertakings, and complex Native American issues. So let's talk about the type of documentation that we prefer to see as far as APE maps. We would like to see a quad map. That's definitely preferred for archaeology. Aerial photographs are fine for built environmental resources, but you definitely want to include one large APE map that gives a great bird eye view, so to speak, of the APE and the general area. This is a good example of an APE map. The boundary is very clearly marked in red. It includes access routes, there's a legend, there's a north arrow and a scale. So you can have one large APE map, and then you can provide additional maps that perhaps zoom into areas of the APE that provide more detail that might be also important for us as we review your submittal. So this is an example of an APE map that we do not want to see. In this case, the APE boundary is very hard to see. It's dark and it blends in with the gray background. It is incomplete boundary, so it appears that it extends on forever, and it's hand-drawn with a shaky hand. There's no legend, there's no north arrow or scale, so I have no idea what I'm looking at. So you definitely want to avoid submitting these type of maps. Project maps are great to submit, but this is not an APE map, so you can submit a project map, of course, in addition to an APE map. Here's an example of a cluttered APE map. I think they intended to provide as much detail as possible, but instead it's just too much information, and it makes it very difficult to identify the APE and where direct and indirect effects are going to occur. So we definitely encourage that you submit drawings and plans, but definitely try to avoid cluttering up the map. So this is another good example of an aerial image of an APE. Might be kind of hard for you to see on the screen, but the boundaries are very clearly marked. The legend is included, north arrow, scale. There's different colors delineating different aspects of the APE. There's also an archaeological APE and an architectural APE. So this is just another good example of what you can submit to our office. Oops, I don't know why the photographs didn't come up. But so once you've delineated and described your APE, move towards identification of historic properties. One thing to remember are districts, potential for districts, and that there may be multi-component sites. So there could be a resource that has both an architectural or built component and an archaeological component. So you definitely want to include both the archaeologist and the historian in that recordation evaluation. So one of the steps in the identification of historic properties is reviewing existing background information. You want to describe all archival research that you conducted. So for instance, are you consulting internal agency cultural files? Have you consulted CRIS record search? Was the entire APE part of your archival search? Was there a buffer? What was the buffer? You don't need to submit all of the results of your record search, so you don't need to attach all of the maps and all of the previous surveys or historic properties within the APE, but you definitely want to provide summarization or even a table that indicates exactly what you found in your record search. Our office does recommend that your archival research efforts are no more than 2 years old. If you're using something older, just explain why it's still applicable and it provides the information that you need to identify historic properties. The next step is to seek and gather information. You do this through consultation. Consultation with Indian tribes. So again, the regulations define Indian tribes as those that are federally recognized. Other consultation can include additional or other consulting parties, so local governments, project applicants, historical societies, and non-federally recognized tribes. You definitely want to describe all correspondence to date. Again, you don't need to include all of your correspondence. So for instance, if you sent the same letter to all of the tribes on your contact list or same letter to historical societies, you don't need to send copies of every single letter. Just include maybe just the template letter is completely fine. And try not to leave the results of your consultation kind of hanging out there in space, so to speak. So if you've indicated that so-and-so asked to see a copy of the survey report, period, and you leave it like that, we definitely want to make sure that you did send the report and that they did or did not respond with comments. So just, again, don't leave anything kind of hanging out there. So just want to take the time to have a word on Native American consultation. Our office understands that Native American consultation is the responsibility of the federal agency, but it doesn't mean that we cannot provide comment, recommendation, or questions about Native American consultation in the context of the federal agency's efforts to identify historic properties, evaluate resources, or resolve adverse effects. So you may get a question or response back from our office. So I'd like to also kind of go over what little c versus big C means. So it's completely fine for the consultant to conduct Native American consultation, the applicant to send letters, follow up emails, phone calls. But once a federally recognized tribe requests government-to-government consultation, also known as Big C, the lead federal agency must consult with that federally recognized tribe. So no one else can take the responsibility for that. We'll also like to talk about reasonable opportunity versus notification. You want to provide Native Americans with the reasonable opportunity to be involved throughout your Section 106 process. There's a big difference between sending a letter and inviting them to help you identify historic properties or evaluate resources within your APE versus sending a letter after the fact, just notifying them of your results and then how you are going to move forward. In some cases, we've received letters that to our office or to the Shippo concurrently at the same time the agency sends letters to the tribe. So in which case the reviewer might decide to wait till almost the end of the 30-day Shippo review period just to afford the tribe adequate time to respond to the agency. We also encourage the agency to contact the Native American Heritage Commission for a search of their sacred lands files and an updated Native American contact list. And we definitely encourage that all contacts are consulted with on the list, not just federally recognized tribes. And definitely you want to, we encourage that you move beyond just sending a letter, so follow up with an email or phone call, and of course project site visits are always encouraged. So other ways that an agency can seek and gather more information, these are just examples. Again, it just depends on the undertaking and potential to affect historic properties. So archaeological pedestrian field surveys, archaeological excavations, of course, building surveys. Our office does prefer that surveys, both archaeological and building, are no more than 5 years old. If you are using something older, then you definitely just want to explain why it's still applicable or it's still valid. Geoarchaeological analysis may be another method used to gather information, and of course additional investigations such as oral interviews, ethnographic work, or desktop soils analysis. So you definitely want to show your work. That's the key. Just remember the cold reader. So for survey reports, you want to specify that the person or persons that conducted the field work, conducted the archival research, meets professional standards in their area of expertise. You want to provide detailed information on the survey methods and methodology that you used. So this includes survey strategies, so transects, survey type, was it intensive, was it reconnaissance, why did you use these type of methods, was the entire APE surveyed, if not, why? Perhaps you had access issues, or there was environmental factors that came into play, such as steep slopes. And of course, again, you want to kind of provide information on the current state of the APE. So was it built environment? Was there poor surface visibility? And again, if you're using a previous or old survey, just justify why it's still valid for identifying historic properties. And when you submit your 523 forms with your report, please make sure that they are complete. And you can also submit maps, photographs of your survey area or APE, and drawings and construction dates are, of course, always welcome for built resources. So what is a reasonable and good faith effort? It depends. It depends on the undertaking, and it depends on the potential for effect. And also past planning and research studies. Perhaps these are still valid, so you can use those rather than update anything. Again, the magnitude and nature of the project or undertaking is going to greatly influence your efforts. And potential for effect. So what is the likelihood for historic properties within the APE? Current land use, again, plays a huge role. Previous ground disturbance, so perhaps it's a built environment with ground disturbing activities, 2 feet below the surface, and your vertical APE does it go beyond 2 feet? So perhaps you don't have to do a subsurface sensitivity analysis. And of course, again, your vertical APE, 2-foot vertical APE versus a 30-foot vertical APE, huge difference. So your level of effort is definitely going to be different for 2-foot versus 30 feet. So after you have identified resources within your APE, move on to evaluation of historic properties. We want to make sure that you have evaluated the resources using all of the 4 criteria. And of course, A is associated with important events. B is the resource associated with the lives of persons. C embodies distinctive characteristics. Or D has the ability to yield or has yielded important information. So your determination of eligibility, or DOE, again, you need to demonstrate that all 4 criteria have been applied. You don't want to just regurgitate the criteria. So for instance, you don't want to use sentences such as, this archaeological resource is not eligible under criterion A because it is not associated to an important event in history. That's not adequate evaluation. You definitely want to describe how your identification efforts such as archival research, archaeological excavations, any other methods that you used, you want to describe how that determined whether or not the resource is or is not eligible under each of the 4 criteria. So you definitely want to develop a well-researched and clear research design with research questions data set requirements, those are all important in your DOE. You want to explain the level of significance, so is the property significant under the national, state, or local level, period of significance, of course your historic context, followed by assessment of integrity, so there's 7 aspects of integrity. And you may also want to discuss contributing and non-contributing elements. So for instance, through testing of an archaeological property, you determine that portion of the property does not contain data that contributes to the overall significance of the resource, but the remaining portion of the site is contributing. You want to explain that in your DOE. And of course, character defining features for built environments. And you want to make sure that you describe or articulate the boundary of the property, either in the site record or on other maps. One thing to remember too as you're drafting your DOE is that it's persuasive writing, you are arguing your point. So you just want to make sure that you have enough information that justifies how you arrived at that conclusion. So things to not forget with your DOE is if the property has been previously determined eligible or ineligible, you want to provide a copy of the Shippo consensus letter. Of course, you want to consider potential historic districts. And thing to remember too is you evaluate significance first, then you determine if the resource maintains enough integrity to convey its significance. Submit your DPR 523 forms. In some cases, an agency may assume eligibility. And this is fine, but definitely want to explain how this property will be avoided and will not be adversely affected. And when you assume eligibility, it is only for that specific undertaking, and you want to indicate what is the property being assumed, what criteria the property is being assumed under. After you've received Shippo consensus on your determination of eligibility, you move forward with the finding of effect, or FOE. Things to include in the FOE narrative: describe the effects, so that you can go back to your undertaking or your APE, list the effects. So direct effects because of, for instance, because of trenching for utilities, indirect effects, shadow effects, that type of thing. You want to list the effects. And the reasoning behind the finding of effect. So you want to, again, justify how you arrived at this conclusion. Important thing to note is that adverse effects result when an undertaking may alter directly or indirectly any of the characteristics of a historic property that qualify the property for inclusion in the National Register. So an undertaking may have effects, but you want to figure out whether or not these effects are adverse to where the property is no longer eligible for the National Register. You can also include supporting documentation, specifications, photo simulations, maps or drawings. So you may want to delineate where the historic property is in relationship to the area of direct impact, indirect effect, so forth. So once you have received Shippo consensus on the finding of effect, you move towards resolution of effects. Memorandum of agreement is a way in which to avoid, minimize, or resolve adverse effects. And there's a different type of consultation with the Shippo that is included in this process. Signatories of the MOA include the federal agency, of course. The Shippo, the federal agency needs to notify the council and invite them to be a signatory. The council may decline though. Invited signatories can include Indian tribes, so again this is federally recognized tribes, and anyone else with responsibilities in the MOA. Other signatories could be concurring parties, so this is anyone else the federal agency wants to include in the MOA. So the MOA is going to outline the terms and conditions to either avoiding, minimizing, or resolving adverse effects. So this could be historic property treatment plans, archaeological treatment plans, discovery plans, or monitoring and avoidance measures. It is the agency's responsibility to draft the MOA, and then as you submit the draft to our office, we provide comments. Our staff does not write agreement documents. And it's important to note that there is no regulatory time frame, so there is no 30-day Shippo review period. It could only maybe take just 30 days to finalize an MOA. It might take months, it might take a year. Just things to keep in mind. Another agreement document that could be drafted to resolve adverse effects is the programmatic agreement, or PA. This is an alternative process for an agency to satisfy Section 106 requirements, but it's important to note that they still have to do all the steps. And it allows the agency to phase the steps. So for instance, if the APE couldn't fully be surveyed during your identification efforts because of access issues, you may need to phase your identification and evaluation of historic properties. So in this case, a PA would be applicable. Definitely want to check out the Council's website for more guidance on agreement documents. And I believe our website also has links too that may be beneficial. So just want to go over some things that the Shippo does not do. The Shippo does not research, identify historic properties, or determine project effects. This is the agency's responsibility. We do not have a complete list of all historic properties within the state, and we unfortunately do not maintain an archive. We have limited space. All of our documents go to the information center. We rarely, if ever, can conduct site visits. This is due to lack of funding and contingent on our workload. We don't issue permits or clearance, and we don't conduct Native American consultation or government-to consultation. Most importantly, the Shippo cannot stop projects. The Shippo comments and assists throughout the Section 106 process. So just some helpful tips next time you are getting ready to submit your Section 106 package to our office. Just remember the cold reader. You could do so by just showing your work. A lot of times consultation with our office gets caught up in back and forth comments and questions because work has not been shown, so to speak, in your consultation package. So just provide as much detail as you can possible. And again, when in doubt, seek us out just for informal questions. I definitely would prefer that because, again, I think it helps the long run expedite consultation with our office. And just factor in the Shippo's 30-day review period throughout the Section 106 process, and allow extra time for the Shippo to provide comment and feedback and ask questions. Once we provide a comment or ask a question, the clock stops, and then once we receive our answer, the clock starts back up again. So you definitely want to be aware of this for you in order to meet your project deadlines. And just remember that consultation is an important and necessary step throughout the Section 106 process. It's not meant to be difficult. It's meant to hear all sides, so to speak, and we may not always agree in the end, but it's definitely trying to reach a consensus in the end. And one way to ensure that consultation runs smoothly is just consult early and often, not only with the Shippo, but with the tribes and other consulting parties. So thank you very much. I guess it's time to answer questions.
Okay, and thank you very much, Alicia. And as a reminder for the people that are dialed in on the phone line, if you need to ask a question, you can press *6 on your phone. For everybody else, you can either type in your question in the chat box on the bottom of the screen, which I will now increase in size so you can see it better. Or if you'd like to ask in person and you're not on the phone, you can just press the raise hand symbol. We'll try to enable your microphone.
Have Mark join me too over here.
Okay, great. No, yeah, we also have Mark Beeson here, historian with the Office of Historic Preservation, here to help answer questions. So far we have 2 questions. First question is coming from Aaron, and the question is, are DPR 523 forms required to be submitted for architectural resources in the area of potential effect, or can identification, analysis, and DOE, or I guess determination of eligibility of each property in a narrative form in the report suffice?
For architectural resources?
Yeah, I think this is a question about architectural resources specifically.
We prefer to see them recorded on a DPR 523 form, but that's not required. The way that Aaron describes that is also done on occasion and can be sufficient. It just depends on what information is presented in the analysis. But yeah, that's possible.
Okay, and the second question. When a federal agency and Shippo disagree on a resource's eligibility, how is that resolved?
Sometimes it can be resolved just through continued consultation. So perhaps just inadequate documentation was submitted to our office. If it can't be resolved through the Shippo and the agency, then the council can be invited to participate in the consultation.
If we're talking about eligibility for listing in the National Register, if there's an impasse, a disagreement between the agency and the Shippo, then the keeper of the National Register can also be invited to weigh in and resolve the dispute.
Great. Still waiting on more questions. It looks like we had a question start to come in, and it looks like some people are typing in questions, so we can wait for those. And maybe while we're waiting, I think I had a question of my own. Alicia, you were talking about the vertical depth of effect in projects, and you said if it's 2 feet, it's completely different from being 9 feet. Can you elaborate on that a bit? Why is the vertical depth important in this case?
So, for instance, going back to talking about the current land use within the APE, so a 2-foot vertical depth in a built environment that may perhaps already have previously ground disturbances to a 2-foot depth, then efforts to do a subsurface analysis probably wouldn't be necessary, versus if within that same APE or urban environment, so to speak, that the vertical APE goes beyond the 2 feet to 9 feet, then you're probably going to want to have further identification efforts to ensure that there are no historic properties below that 2-foot previous ground disturbance. Does that make sense?
Great. Yeah, it does. And then we had a question from Paige and Turnbull asking.
There's always the question too of whether or not.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
There's always the question too. We can't see. Oh, sorry. we can't see what's underground. So in some cases there may be subsurface deposits. So in order to determine this, you have to do further investigation. So like I was saying, you might need to do, a desktop soil analysis to determine the age of the soil. So a Pleistocene soil versus Holocene soil. So younger soils are more likely to have prehistoric deposits versus very old soils. So just something to indicate or include in your identification efforts when you're justifying why you did or did not do further analysis, so to speak.
Great, thank you. And then a question came in regarding identifying an area of potential effect for proposed construction. Does the Shippo have guidance on determining the area in which a new project might be visible given the height of the proposed building? And this is specifically on the visual impact of the building.
I don't have any guidance about that beyond what's included in the definition of the APE in the regulations. There may be something in our annotated Section 106 submittal checklist, but I don't recall. It's sort of, but the question gets at the key part of that, which is the visibility of the new, if it's a new building, where it will be visible from would be the area to include in the APE.
Okay, and just a note, since Mark, you mentioned the checklist at the top left-hand side of the screen, we provided those PDFs. So if you need to download those and take a look at them, they're there. And Alicia also included them as links in her PowerPoint. Somebody's asking if you can elaborate on combining NEPA and Section 106 review, and are there instances where this is advisable and instances when it's not advisable?
Well, they're two different processes, but I think what is important to note is that your process to identify historic properties may be helpful when looking at alternatives in the NEPA process and how these may or may not affect historic properties. I don't know if Mark has more experience with the NEPA and the 106.
That's it. Yeah, it's sort of an advanced question for the presentation today. I'd recommend that if someone is curious about that, there's some information. The Advisory Council published some guidance, I think, a couple of years ago about this part of the regulations is 36 CFR 800.8. It's a fairly involved conversation to have. If there are specific questions, maybe that'd be good to reach out to us individually to ask. But there are the benefits are that it avoids duplication of effort for two different processes that will result in similar analysis. That's supposed to be the benefit.
Okay, great, thank you. And we'll see if we could dig up some of these links for you after the webinar and send them to you by email. The next question is, are there any significant timeframes besides a 30-day review during the consultation process?
No. I think it's definitely that you should be aware of your timeframes when you're putting your package together and submitting it to our office for review. And again, just like earlier, I just wanted to be clear that each time we have a question or a comment, the clock stops, and we basically don't restart the clock until we get answers to our questions. So that could make an additional 30 days on top of what you just thought you were only going to have 30 days. Now we have another 30 days. So just things to keep in mind.
Okay.
So again, the agreement documents can take longer than 30 days. In most cases, they do.
Right. Okay. A question from Gilda is asking, how can I find documentation on the status of a NRHP, National Register of Historic Places, nomination for a historic district that was developed in 1993, because the National Register does not currently show this historic district as listed.
Oh.
That'd be a registration unit?
Yeah.
That might be a question for our registration unit. My contact information again is provided in this webinar, so you might want to just go ahead and forward that question to me, and I can forward it off to the registration unit folks.
Great. I might also add, it might be something that you can find out through one of the information centers throughout the state, because they maintain a lot of these records, I'm assuming, including the nomination forms. Mike T provided us with a handbook for integrating NEPA and Section 106, so take a look at the chat box. If you're interested in doing both of those processes as one, that should help you out. And then there's a question for agreement documents. Do concurring parties have to sign the document? In other words, if they don't sign the document, can they hold it up or void it?
No. Concurring parties don't have to sign the document. In fact, when those who do agree to sign the document, their responsibility is only in, I believe, amending the document. Signatories have the responsibility to execute, amend, and terminate the agreement document. And invited signatories only have responsibilities as far as amending and terminating. And the invited signatories, they also don't have to sign the agreement document if they choose not to.
Okay. Still have about 5 minutes if we need it for more questions. A reminder, if you want to ask a question in person, just press *6 on your phone, or just type your question into the chat box. And we'll wait around here for another 30 seconds or a minute or so to see if any questions come in. If not, we'll move over to the evaluation portion of this presentation, which is the end of it. But while we're waiting for any final questions to come in, I wanted to thank our speaker Alicia today, as well as Mark, for being here for their time and effort. Also thank the Office of Historic Preservation for their partnership in these quarterly programs. Again, these are free programs, so if you need a recording for any of the past programs, you can find them on our website. I think the Shippo also has a page where they link to these programs. You can get the recording for free on our webpage. Other than that, I wanted to remind everybody that we have a special offer now for people who are interested in next Wednesday's webinar on historic bridges, preserving historic highway bridges. And if you become a member of the California Preservation Foundation between now and Friday, you'll get that webinar for free. If you are already a member and you register between now and Friday, you'll also get that webinar for free. So that's just another benefit of joining CPF. And so we don't see any further questions, and I'm going to close the webinar now and move over to the evaluation. So please do send us your thoughts and suggestions for future programs. 1 second, I'm going to pull up this survey here. It was up earlier, but for some reason it disappeared. So give me a minute here, and I'll throw up the multiple response survey. And with that being said, I'm going to turn off the sound, but please wait around and leave us your thoughts. And thanks again to our speakers. Okay, have a wonderful day, everybody, and let us know what you thought of today's program.